In the final months of World War II, many believed the nightmare was finally ending. But the Allied soldiers began opening gates to places the Nazis never wanted seen. What they found there were camps filled with human suffering on a scale no one had imagined, and it would haunt the soldiers for the rest of their lives. The first major Nazi concentration camp discovered, almost completely intact, was Majdanek, located just outside the city of Lublin in eastern Poland. On July 23, 1944, Soviet troops from the Second Belarusian Front entered the area during their rapid advance westward. German forces had retreated so fast that they didn't have time to destroy the camp or remove most of the evidence. The camp began operating in October 1941, shortly after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. At first, it was built to hold Soviet prisoners of war, many of whom died within weeks from hunger, exposure, and disease. Over time, the camp expanded and became both a concentration camp and an extermination site. Prisoners arrived by train from Poland, Germany, Czechoslovakia, France, the Netherlands, and other occupied areas. Transports often arrived without food or water after days of travel. By the time Soviet forces arrived, an estimated 78,000 people had been murdered at Majdanek. Around 59,000 of them were Jews. Others included Polish political prisoners, members of resistance groups, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma people, and civilians accused of breaking Nazi rules. Many were killed shortly after arrival. Others were worked to death in nearby factories, workshops, and labor details. The killing methods at Majdanek were varied and constant. Gas chambers used Zyklon B pellets, the same poison later associated with Auschwitz. Some victims were shot in mass executions near large pits. Others died from starvation rations, brutal beatings, untreated illness, or exhaustion from forced labor. Death was part of daily camp life. What shocked Soviet soldiers most was how much physical proof remained. Gas chambers were still standing, with doors, vents, and residue still visible. Crematorium ovens were intact and showed clear signs of recent use. Nearby fields contained piles of ashes dumped directly onto the ground. Warehouses were filled with thousands of personal belongings taken from victims just before death. Inside these storage buildings were mountains of shoes, children's clothing, eyeglasses, suitcases with names written on them, cooking pots, prayer items, and other everyday objects. Soviet troops also found execution pits filled with human remains. They uncovered piles of bones that had not been fully burned. Even more damaging were the documents. Camp records listed transport dates, prisoner numbers, work assignments, and death counts. These papers showed that the murders were planned, recorded, and managed over time. For the first time during the war, the Nazi killing center had been exposed before it could be erased. The discovery of Majdanek caused immediate panic among Nazi leaders. Heinrich Himmler, who controlled the SS and the camp system, ordered camps close to advancing Allied forces to be evacuated or destroyed. The goal was to move prisoners deeper into Germany and eliminate any evidence of mass killing before it could be seen. This led to forced evacuations that became known as death marches. Beginning in late 1944 and continuing into early 1945, prisoners were driven out of camps on foot with little food, no warm clothing, and no medical care. Marches lasted days or weeks. Anyone who collapsed from weakness or illness was often shot immediately. Thousands died along roadsides, in forests, and in villages across occupied Europe. Some camps had already been erased before Majdanek was discovered. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were extermination camps created under Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to murder Jews in occupied Poland. These camps did not function as long-term prisons. Most people sent there were killed within hours of arrival. By late 1943, the majority of Jews in the region had been murdered. the Nazis dismantled these camps. Gas chambers were torn down. Bodies were dug up and burned. Ashes were scattered or buried. Trees were planted to hide the land. Small farms and buildings were placed nearby to make the sites look ordinary. Over 1.7 million Jews were murdered at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka combined. As Allied forces closed in during 1945, the Nazis shifted priorities. They no longer focused only on killing prisoners. They focused on hiding what had already been done. But despite every attempt to erase the evidence, the system collapsed faster than it could be hidden. Majdanek had exposed the truth early. What followed would confirm that it was not an exception, but part of a continent-wide system of destruction. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army reached the town of Oświęcim in southern Poland. Just outside the town stood Auschwitz, the largest and deadliest camp complex created by Nazi Germany. It was not a single camp, but a massive system built for imprisonment, forced labor, and mass murder. The complex included Auschwitz I, the original camp, Auschwitz II Birkenau, the main killing center, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a labor camp tied to German industry. More than 40 smaller subcamps surrounded the area. Auschwitz had been operating since May 1940. At first, it held Polish political prisoners. In 1942, it became the center of the Nazi plan to murder Europe's Jews. Trains arrived daily from across the continent. Jews from Hungary, Poland, France, Greece, Italy, and the Netherlands were unloaded onto the ramp at Birkenau. Many were killed within hours of arrival. As Soviet forces moved closer in January 1945, the SS began evacuating the camp. Around 60,000 prisoners were forced out on foot toward Germany and Austria. When Soviet troops entered Auschwitz, about 7,000 prisoners were still alive. Most were too sick or weak to be marched out. Among them were hundreds of children, including twins and teenagers used for medical experiments. Many survivors could not understand that the guards were gone and freedom had arrived. Inside the camp, Soviet soldiers encountered scenes few could process. Barracks were filled with corpses lying on wooden bunks or on the floor. In Birkenau, the soldiers found gas chambers and crematoria designed for continuous killing. These buildings had rooms for undressing, sealed chambers for poisoning, and furnaces capable of burning bodies day and night. Near the crematoria and storage areas, warehouses revealed the scale of the crime. More than 370,000 men's suits were stacked in piles. Over 800,000 women's dresses filled long rows. Around 7 tons of human hair had been collected, shaved from victims after arrival, and stored for industrial use. There were also mountains of shoes, eyeglasses, toothbrushes, cooking utensils, prayer items, and thousands of prosthetic limbs taken from disabled prisoners. Auschwitz had murdered more than 1.1 million people, and after it, denial was no longer possible. In February 1945, Soviet forces advancing through Lower Silesia reached the concentration camp of Gross-Rosen. The camp had been operating since August 1940 and was originally a subcamp of Sachsenhausen before becoming independent in 1941. Over the course of the war, more than 125,000 prisoners passed through it and its network of subcamps. At least 40,000 people died there. Gross-Rosen was built around a massive granite stone quarry. Prisoners were forced to extract and haul heavy stone blocks by hand, often while malnourished and beaten. The work was intentionally exhausting. Many prisoners collapsed under the weight of the stones or fell from the quarry walls. Guards regularly beat or shot those who could not continue. Death from exhaustion, injury, and starvation was common. As Soviet troops approached, the SS evacuated most of the prisons in death marches toward camps farther west. By the time the Red Army entered Gross-Rosen, the camp was largely empty. What remained told the story quite clearly. Mass graves lay near the campgrounds. Barracks were burned or destroyed in an attempt to hide evidence. Survivors who had been left behind were too sick, weak, or injured to move. Many were near death. Medical facilities at the camp were almost non-existent. Disease spread quickly among those still alive. Soviet medics struggled to save those who could still be helped. Many died in the days following liberation. As the Red Army continued west, more eastern camps were discovered. One of the last was Stutov, located near the city of Danzig on the Baltic coast. Stutov had been operating since September 1939, making it one of the earliest Nazi camps. Over 110,000 prisoners were held there during the war. Around 65,000 died. In the final months, Stutov became a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from other camps. Overcrowding, hunger, and disease killed thousands. As Soviet forces approached, prisoners were marched toward the Baltic Sea in freezing weather. Many were shot along the way. Others were driven onto the ice or into the water and drowned. Each camp uncovered by the Red Army added more proof of a system built on destruction. On April 11, 1945, American forces from the 6th Armored Division reached Buchenwald, located near the city of Weimar in central Germany. Buchenwald had been operating since July 1937 and was one of the largest concentration camps inside Germany. Unlike extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Buchenwald was designed for forced labor, punishment, and terror, rather than mass gassing. Between 1937 and 1945, more than 280,000 prisoners passed through Buchenwald and its many subcamps. Prisoners included Jews, political opponents, resistance members, prisoners of war, Roma, homosexuals, and people labeled as criminals by the Nazi state. At least 56,000 people died from starvation, disease, executions, medical experiments, and brutal labor. As American forces approached, SS guards began fleeing the camp. In the final days, prisoners organized secretly and staged a partial uprising. They disarmed the remaining guards and took control of parts of the camp shortly before U.S. troops arrived. When American soldiers entered Buchenwald, they encountered scenes that many would never forget. Survivors were severely emaciated, some weighing little more than children. Corpses were piled in open areas and inside barracks, stacked without care. Execution sites were still visible. Medical rooms showed signs of experiments performed on living prisoners without consent or anesthesia. The smell of death filled the air and could be detected far beyond the camp gates. Civilians from nearby Weimar were forced by American authorities to walk through Buchenwald and see the conditions. Many claimed they had no knowledge of what had happened there. The evidence around them told a different story. Buchenwald proved that the concentration camp system was not hidden only in occupied lands. It existed in Germany itself, close to major cities, supported by industry, and maintained for years. And more of these were waiting. On April 15, 1945, British troops from the 11th Armored Division entered the Bergen-Belsen camp in northern Germany. They had been warned that disease was spreading inside, but nothing prepared them for what they actually found. The scene inside the camp would become one of the most well-known images of the war in Europe. Bergen-Belsen was first created in 1940 as a prisoner of war camp. In 1943, it was turned into a prisoner exchange camp, where some Jews were held to be traded for German civilians abroad. This purpose quickly disappeared. By 1944, Bergen-Belsen became a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps closer to the front lines. Trains arrived constantly, unloading sick, starving people who had already survived other camps and death marches. There were no gas chambers at Bergen-Belsen. Killing was not organized through poison or machinery. People died slowly from hunger, disease, and complete neglect. Food rations were cut to almost nothing. Clean water became unavailable. Sanitation collapsed. barracks built for hundreds held thousands. When British forces arrived, around 60,000 prisoners were still alive inside the camp. Most were severely malnourished. Many were too weak to stand or speak. Another 13,000 bodies lay unburied across the camp grounds, in open fields, between barracks, and along pathways. Death had become so constant that survivors were forced to live beside corpses. Typhus was spreading uncontrollably. Lice covered clothing and skin. Dysentery and tuberculosis were widespread. The camp's water system had failed, forcing prisoners to drink contaminated water. Toilets no longer functioned. British medical teams and aid workers acted immediately. Emergency food stations were set up. Survivors were moved to nearby facilities. Barracks were burned to stop the spread of disease. Even with help, thousands were too far gone. Their bodies could no longer recover. Many died in the days and weeks after liberation. In total, more than 50,000 people died at Bergen-Belsen. Nearly 14,000 of them died after the camp was liberated. But even this camp was not the beginning. On April 29, 1945, American troops from the 45th Infantry Division reached Dachau, located near Munich in southern Germany. Dachau was the first Nazi concentration camp, opened in March 1933, just weeks after Adolf Hitler came into power. What began as a camp for political opponents became the blueprint for the entire concentration camp system. Over the next 12 years, Dachau expanded into a network of subcamps across southern Germany and Austria. More than 200,000 prisoners passed through Dachau and its subcamps. At least 41,000 people died there. As American soldiers approached Dachau, they encountered a train standing on a railway siding just outside the camp. Inside the freight cars were around 2,000 bodies. These prisoners had been transported from Buchenwald. Most had died from starvation, disease, or exposure during the journey. Many had been dead for days. Inside the camp, conditions were catastrophic. Barracks were packed far beyond capacity. Prisoners were skeletal, many unable to move. Disease spread unchecked. Corpses lay in bunks, hallways, and courtyards. Some had not yet been removed because there was no one left strong enough to carry them. The camp crematorium stood nearby, still intact. Execution areas were visible. Records showed systematic punishment and killing over many years. The sight of the camp enraged many American soldiers. Some guards who had surrendered were shot on the spot. Others were beaten. Military investigations later examined these actions, but the reaction reflected the shock and anger of men who had just witnessed the results of 12 years of cruelty. And it had only ended because the gates were forced open. As Allied armies moved deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, they uncovered dozens of camps and hundreds of smaller subcamps spread across cities, forests, factories, and mountains. These camps were tied together by rail lines and paperwork, forming a single system that stretched across the collapsing Reich. Many of these places had received prisoners evacuated from camps closer to the front, making conditions even worse in the final months. One of the most shocking discoveries was Mittelbau-Dora, located near Nordhausen in central Germany. This camp was built around underground tunnels carved into a mountain. Prisoners were forced to live and work entirely below ground, assembling V-2 rockets used to bombard cities like London and Antwerp. The tunnels were dark, wet, and filled with dust. Prisoners slept beside the machines they worked on. Food was scarce. Disease spread rapidly, and beatings were routine. More than 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora, and over 20,000 died from starvation, exhaustion, executions, and untreated illness. Another camp uncovered in the final weeks was Flossenburg, located in Bavaria near the Czech border. Flossenburg operated from 1938 and held political prisoners, resistance fighters, clergy, and people accused of opposing the Nazi regime. Prisoners were forced to work in stone quarries and armaments factories. Executions increased sharply in the final year of the war. More than 30,000 prisoners died at Flossenburg due to starvation, forced labor, disease, and targeted killings. Mauthausen, liberated by U.S. forces on May 5, 1945, stood out for its extreme brutality. Located in Austria near the Danube River, Mauthausen was classified as a camp for incorrigible prisoners, meaning survival was never expected. Prisoners were forced to carry heavy granite blocks up 186 steep steps from the quarry below, a path known as the Stairway of Death. Many fell and were crushed by those behind them. Others were beaten or shot. At least 90,000 people died at Mauthausen from overwork, starvation, exposure, and execution. Across Germany and Austria, similar scenes repeated themselves. Camps like Neuengamme, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, and countless subcamps were discovered in various states of collapse. Food supplies had run out. Guards had fled or abandoned their posts. Prisoners were left to die among the dead. Each camp had its own layout and purpose, but the system behind them was always the same. Prisoners were stripped of identity, starved, beaten, and worked until their bodies failed. Death was not by accident. It was the expected result. After the war ended, investigators began the slow process of documenting what had happened. Military teams, medical experts, and international organizations entered the camps to record evidence. Graves were opened, records were collected, survivors were interviewed. The task was overwhelming. As numbers were gathered, the scale of the crime became clear. Around 10 million people were murdered in the Holocaust. Entire families vanished. Ancient communities were wiped out. In many towns, no one returned. Researchers later identified more than 44,000 camps, ghettos, forced labor sites, transit camps, and detention centers spread across Nazi-controlled Europe. These sites ranged from massive killing centers to small work camps attached to factories or farms. Together, they formed a system designed to control, exploit, and destroy human beings. In November 1945, the Nuremberg trials put leading Nazi officials on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. During the proceedings, footage from liberated camps was shown in court. Judges, prosecutors, and defendants watched images of skeletal survivors, mass graves, gas chambers, and crematoria. Some Nazi leaders denied personal responsibility. Others claimed they were following orders or did not know the full extent of the killings. These arguments collapsed under the weight of documents, photographs, and testimony. For the first time, the world saw what modern mass murder looked like when carried out by a powerful state. It was not chaotic. It was structured. And it had been allowed to happen while much of the world looked away.